Since the topic of return on investment is so big in fantasy football this week, let's talk about the best returns on investment when looking at where players were drafted versus where they finished for fantasy football in 2023. Brock Purdy was drafted as a quarterback 19, but finished as the quarterback 6 for fantasy football. Purdy had 7 top 10 fantasy finishes in 2023, and during the fantasy football season, he threw for 4,280 passing yards and 31 touchdowns. Baker Mayfield was this year's Geno Smith. He was drafted as the quarterback 31, but he finished as the quarterback 9 for fantasy football. 8 top 12 fantasy finishes. Through week 17, Baker Mayfield had career highs in passing yards with 3,907 and passing touchdowns with 28. For running backs, the veteran Raheem Mostert was being drafted as the running back 41, but he finishes the running back 3 for fantasy football. This included 4 weeks as a top 5 fantasy running back. Through 17 weeks, Mostert had his first 1,000 rushing yard season with 1,012. And if you combined all of his prior seasons, he had 14 total rushing touchdowns. In 2023, he had 18. Kyren Williams was being drafted as the running back 81, but he finishes the running back 5, which is scary because he only played in 12 games. And in those 12 games, Kyren Williams finished as the running back 9 or better in 9 of them. 1,144 rushing yards, 12 rushing touchdowns, 32 receptions, 206 receiving yards, 3 receiving touchdowns, all in just 12 games. Rachaad White was being drafted as the running back 24, but finishes the running back 6. White finished 9 weeks as a top 12 fantasy running back, and through 16 games played, he finished with 915 rushing yards, 6 rushing touchdowns, 60 receptions, and 3 receiving touchdowns. Solid sophomore year. The biggest surprise of fantasy football this year, Puka Nacua was drafted as the wide receiver 101, but finishes the wide receiver 5. Puka finished 8 weeks as a top 12 wide receiver for fantasy, and 4 of those he was a top 5 wide receiver for fantasy. 154 targets, 101 receptions, 1,445 receiving yards, and 5 touchdowns through 16 games played is quite the rookie season. Many faded Keenan Allen this year, and although he missed the fantasy football playoffs, he was great this year. Allen was drafted as the wide receiver 19, but finished as the wide receiver 6. The veteran finished 3 weeks as the wide receiver 1 for fantasy football, and 5 weeks as a top 5 wide receiver for fantasy football. 150 targets, 108 receptions, 1,243 receiving yards, 7 touchdowns, all in 13 games. Then I want to shout out Brandon Ayuk. He was drafted as the wide receiver 28, but he finishes the wide receiver 12 for fantasy football. Ayuk finished 3 weeks as a top 5 wide receiver, catching 72 of his 101 targets for a career-high 1,317 receiving yards and 7 touchdowns. Another one of my favorite players to make this list, drafted as a tight end 18, Sam Laporta finished as the tight end 1 as a rookie. Laporta finished 10 weeks as a top 10 fantasy tight end and 7 weeks as a top 5 fantasy tight end. Through 16 games played, Laporta caught 81 of his 113 targets for 860 receiving yards and 9 touchdowns. Hell of a rookie season. Dynasty tight end 1. Trey McBride was being drafted as the tight end 35, but finished as the tight end 8. Which makes me feel a type of way because there were some of you guys behind the scenes talking about how I was way off for being high on this guy. And I heard about it and I didn't say anything. McBride finished 4 weeks as a top 3 fantasy tight end and 8 weeks as a top 12 fantasy tight end, and he opened up the season not the starter. 78 catches on 100 targets for 791 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns in 16 games. Then the final guy I'm going to mention is Jake Ferguson. I took a big L on him because I didn't think he would even be the starter. He was drafted as a tight end 26. He finished as a tight end 9. He had a good season. It was an L by me. Ferguson finished 9 weeks as a top 12 fantasy tight end, catching 65 of his 96 targets for 692 receiving yards and 5 touchdowns through 16 games.